Hello, and thank you for joining us today. As underscored in the IPCC's recent report, global warming is projected to further intensify the global water cycle, including its variability, global monsoon precipitation, and the severity of wet and dry events. Climate change creates monumental challenges for resilient societies, including two that underpinned our current content today. Increasing frequency and intensity of flooding, like we saw in Germany this summer, and decreasing availability of clean drinking water, like we're seeing in the Western US right now. My name is Jeff Montera, and I'm the director of CDM Smith's International Development Practice, where we partner with clients across the globe on designing and implementing sustainable infrastructure that accounts for the rapidly increasing challenges posed by climate change. In this storytelling session, we're going to show you 4 innovative water planning and adaptation tools our firm has developed to better manage water within the context of climate change. Before we begin our session, let me introduce you to our environmental engineering firm and speakers. While I'm doing so, please use the poll function and tell us which water challenges you're facing. CDM Smith is a global engineering and construction firm that was founded in 1947 and is proud to provide legendary client service and smart solutions in water, environment, transportation, energy, and facilities. As a privately owned company, we reinvest in our people, tools, and technology to find better solutions, including our research and development lab, which has helped us develop some of the tools we'll be showing you today. Ranked number 4 in water by Engineering News Record, our firm is developing innovative solutions that address critical climate change issues in the water sector. It's my pleasure to introduce you to 2 of our water and climate experts who will share with you 4 tools they developed to address some of the water challenges we're facing as a planet. First, we have Mr. Dan Rodrigo, CDM Smith's Global One Water Practice Leader. Dan will explain the resiliency advantages of adopting a one water systems approach and also provide a demonstration of CDM Smith's water integration tool. As you will see, the tool allows decision makers and stakeholders to transparently and intuitively assess a series of scenarios and strategies. This tool takes into account all aspects of the water cycle, which is critical for resilient infrastructure planning and policy decisions. Then we will hear from Dr. Mark Maimomi, CDM Smith's Climate Change Discipline Leader. Mark will recap the shortcomings of the current climate change models and then share 3 new peer-reviewed tools that utilize global climate model outputs to make more accurate and actionable predictions. These are the modified delta change factor approach for assessing likely future precipitation patterns, the stochastic weather generator for exploring precipitation variability, and the change flood frequency tool for assessing storm surge probabilities affected by sea level rise. At the end of each speaker's content, we'll have a few minutes for question and answers. If you have a question, please use the poll feature to ask it and be sure to include your email address so that we can connect with you later if we're not able to address it live. We're very excited to connect with all of you, and it's our hope that in sharing these state-of-the-art tools with you today, we can help inspire different ways of thinking about solutions to the water challenges we're all facing in our changing climate. With that, I'll turn it over to Dan.
Thanks for that introduction, Jeff. So today I'm going to be presenting an overview of One Water and how it can benefit urban water systems. And then I'm going to present and demonstrate CDM Smith's water integration tool that can be used for One Water evaluations. But before I talk about One Water, I'd like to just expand upon what Jeff talked about in terms of climate risk. We are already seeing the impacts of climate change on our water resources. We're seeing more frequent and severe droughts. We're seeing reduced mountain snowpack, which is a source of much of our water supply in those regions that have mountains. We're also seeing more frequent and severe flooding. In fact, sometimes there are areas that have a drought and in the span of 1 year go to extreme flooding. So we're seeing those kinds of extremes. Along the coast where we have groundwater, we're seeing saline groundwater intrusion that's occurring because of sea level rise. We're seeing increasing wildfires, which can impact our source water. And because of extreme heat events, we're seeing degraded source water quality, things like algae blooms and stratification of our lakes. So let's shift to one water and let's talk about a definition. So from a practitioner standpoint, one water is a framework for the integrated management of water resources that takes a holistic view of water, wastewater, and stormwater. Through this integrated lens, multi-purpose and multi-benefit solutions are uncovered, and when implemented, lead to improved utility system reliability, long-term sustainability, protection of the natural environment, and climate resiliency. So that's kind of a tall order, right? So let's talk about what a non-integrated urban water system looks like. And this is still the predominant way that we're managing our urban water systems. It's a siloed approach and very linear in nature. We tap our freshwater supplies, that could be surface water or groundwater. We treat that water to serve our municipal demand. That demand generates wastewater, which is sent to a sanitary collection system and treatment system. That water then is discharged back into the environment. In oftentimes a completely different system for managing stormwater and urban runoff, we have a storm drainage system that's designed to carry away water quickly out of the urban environment mainly for flood purposes. And that water is often sent back to the environment untreated. And while this linear, non-integrated urban system has served us well in the past, there are many emerging challenges, which is making this more challenging. The first is we're becoming over-reliant on the Earth's fresh water. So while the amount of fresh water on the Earth is about 3%, only about 0.5% is easily usable. We're seeing more frequent and severe droughts, as I talked about. We're seeing more frequent and intense flooding. We're seeing degraded environment and receding water quality. And we have aging infrastructure and extreme heat that's impacting that infrastructure. So all of this is resulting in a less sustainable and resilient system. So now let's talk about what a one water system looks like. So I'll start with managing stormwater. We can capture stormwater in detention basins, and also we can use deep infiltration to augment our freshwater sources. We can use green infrastructure, things like green streets, green roofs, biofiltration, to help limit the amount of stormwater that goes back to the environment and provide natural treatment so that water is cleaner. We can employ water conservation, reducing system losses. We can implement lot scale reuse system, cisterns, gray water, black water systems to make ourselves more efficient in the way that we utilize water. And we can reuse wastewater. We can use that for non-potable reuse for things like irrigation and cooling towers. We can also, through water purification, create potable reuse that augments our water supply or goes back directly into the treatment system. And through those mechanisms, we can reduce sanitary overflows. Now, all of these stormwater and conservation and reuse strategies all reduce the flows from our freshwater sources. They all reduce our flows going through our water and our wastewater treatment plants. And this saves energy, reduces greenhouse gas emissions, and it improves our environment. And then when needed, we can bring in alternative water supplies, aquifer storage and recovery, or desalination. In addition, many urban functions benefit from a one water approach. So on the water side, obviously, we can improve our water reliability and we can implement water efficiency for our urban landforms. We can also utilize clean hydropower from our reservoir operations for energy production. On the wastewater side, we can purify that wastewater for direct water supply. We can recycle that wastewater, and we can recover energy from biogases. On stormwater, we can capture that stormwater for water supply, but we can use green infrastructure to reduce the urban runoff on our streets and transportation systems. We can improve the water quality of our open space and environment, and we can reduce flooding and heat impacts in our urban landform. So I want to talk about a few examples of One Water plans that CDM Smith has prepared. Back in 2015, we completed the Ireland One Water Framework Directive. The outcomes of that effort were comprehensive river basin management, water quality protection, an evaluation of the water tourism and economy nexus, and capacity building. In Los Angeles in 2007, and again updated in 2018, we did the One Water LA program. The outcomes of that was a sanitary master plan, green infrastructure projects from a $500 million voter-approved bond measure, and bold strategy for potable reuse. In 2019, we did Austin, Texas Water Forward program. The recommendations are currently underway. An expanded water conservation program focusing on system losses and AMI technology, lot scale reuse and stormwater capture, aquifer storage and recovery, and indirect potable reuse. And just most recently, for one of the largest utilities in Florida, JEA, which serves the Jacksonville metropolitan area in northern Florida, we did an integrated water resources plan. And those recommendations included an expanded water conservation program, an expanded non-potable reuse system, potable reuse, and brackish groundwater desalination. So One Water does require new tools and techniques. The first of which is systems thinking. What is systems thinking? Well, because we're integrating multiple systems and we're interfacing with the environment, which is also a system, we need to understand how those systems are linked and how they respond when we move the needle. If I push one part of a system up, what happens to the rest of the systems? Are they going to respond positively? Are they going to respond negatively? How is that going to work? So systems thinking is essential for One Water. We also have to account for risk, things like climate, changing climate. Also, what's going on in terms of our development? What's going on in terms of regulations? We also want to be able to incorporate the principles of sustainability and resiliency in the way that we look at our water resources systems. We want to involve stakeholders. These can be institutional stakeholders, they can be public stakeholders, they can be non-government organizational stakeholders. In incorporating stakeholders, we make our programs more robust and acceptable. And adaptive management is very critical. We are oftentimes looking 50 to even 100 years out into the future when we do these One Water strategies. Obviously, we're not going to implement every project on day one. So we need to use principles of adaptive management where we have signposts and we can monitor those signposts over time. And as a result, we can implement projects in a more strategic, ongoing process rather than having a static plan. And finally, capacity building, which is so important. We need to be able to develop tools that we can help the institutional knowledge when we employ these tools. How do we actually do learning and give the tools and techniques to people who need them? So along those lines, CDM Smith, through its R&D program, created the Water Integration Tool, or WIT. This tool uses a non-proprietary simulation software. It's an easy-to-use tool. It's not a black box model. And most importantly, we think it facilitates systems learning. So the inputs to the tool include rainfall, hydrology, land use and soil types, water demands and supplies, utility system constraints, and flood impact areas. What's nice about the tool is we can input this data in a variety of disaggregated ways. We can look at it in a general watershed sense. We can zero in terms of a specific city. We can use data that maybe isn't as precise as we would like it to be. And then when we get that precision, we can go back into the tool and add that. So it's a very flexible set of inputs. We then use scenario planning to account for uncertainties. So looking at climate change, technology advancements, population growth, economic development, regulations. We then use the tool to evaluate strategies. These can be conservation, water reuse, green infrastructure, energy recovery, new storage. And the tool then gives us a number of outputs that are very important. How often do water shortages occur into the future? How large are those water shortages? What are our water and wastewater treatment capacities? When are we reaching those capacities? What are the ending period storage in our reservoirs and our groundwater levels? What about stormwater and pollutant loading, greenhouse gas emissions, and capital and OpEx costs? Another important aspect of what the water integration tool can do is it can evaluate both centralized and decentralized alternatives. So, you know, we know what the centralized alternatives look like. They're the centralized potable water system or the centralized sanitary system, and even in some cases, a centralized recycled water system. But we can also look at decentralized alternatives, things like lot scale gray water and black water systems that can take some of the wastewater stream at a lot size or a building scale, use treatment on site to provide for irrigation or toilet flushing or cooling tower use. We can also use cisterns to capture rainwater to be used for irrigation. And we can use satellite wastewater treatment for neighborhoods and campuses. The software platform that the water integration tool is built upon is called Powersim. This is a simulation, a generic simulation software, a Norwegian company. It's very flexible. We have customized this Powersim with pre-programmed elements. It's a drag and drop interface, and we have pre-programmed elements for the watersheds, for treatment plants, groundwater, et cetera. The model runs very quickly, either monthly or daily simulations, and it can be utilized at a municipal or a regional scale. So I'd like to just do a short demonstration of the tool. So the tool starts with the model build component. And where you are doing this, you're dragging and dropping certain elements. So let's say a primary wastewater treatment plant. You can also link a river segment to a reservoir, for example. And then each of these elements are built using simple formulas or importing data from Excel. So for example, on the demand, we can import a demand forecast, or we can actually type in seasonal factors. We can split indoor versus outdoor demands. For the reservoir, we can put in things like seepage rates, withdrawal releases, minimum releases, reservoir capacities, initial storage, and even rule curves for the reservoir. So I'm going to go into the condensed format here where I can actually pick a future condition. Let's pick 2040 and let's run the model. And what you're seeing is the model is running in real time. It's very quick. These are seasonal demands and supplies. That's why you see these little peaks and valleys. You can see in the red the water shortages. And this is for a historical period from 1940 to 2016. This is for an example. This is actually Austin. You can see periods of drought where the ending period reservoir storage decreases. And what happens if I add climate change? And this is just 20 years of climate change. Now all of a sudden you see much more shortages, and most of those shortages are in the summer months. And you see storage has come way down, the ending period storage. Now, what if I implement drought restrictions? So restricting the water use, mainly in the summer months, preventing irrigation from occurring. You can see I've eliminated the shortages, but my reservoir levels are still down. Now let's go to 2115 and run those same conditions. So even with drought restrictions on, with climate change, now I see that there are shortages every year. And the storage has come even more dangerously low. So now I can start implementing solutions. I can turn groundwater ASR on, I can add water conservation, and I can add lot scale reuse and stormwater capture. And let's run that. And now you see I've reduced the shortages. There's only just a few drought periods where we have shortages. And now I can add a new reservoir and I can see what happens there. Okay, so I've solved the water shortage problem. I have no more water shortages, even looking out 100 years with climate change. So now let's talk about some of the output. This is the demand and the supply. I can show a reference period, basically without the solutions. So the dark line shows the new supplies, the dashed line shows what the supplies were, the dashed red shows where the shortages were. So you can get a comparison, right? This is the wastewater discharge. So the wastewater is lower because I've implemented water conservation. In water quality, the red or the orange is where the water quality was in terms of loading. The blue is where it is now. I can also look at cost. Current cost is about $1.90 for per 1,000 gallons. The new option is about $7, and the blended is about $4. I can also look at greenhouse gases. I can look at the sources of my energy. You can see that I can look at the changes in emissions, and then I can change the mix of future energy. I can reduce the coal and the oil. I can increase natural gas, solar and wind, and hydroelectric. And when I do that, even with the growth in the demand and the new treatment, because I've changed the mix of our energy, I can actually show that we could get an 18% reduction in greenhouse gases for the next 100 years. So that's a brief demonstration of the water integration tool. Hope you found it useful. In summary, One Water takes an integrated view of all water resources. One Water increases reliability, sustainability, and climate resiliency. One Water does require new tools and techniques, and CDM Smith's water integration tool offers powerful analytics for One Water evaluations. And with that, we can take some questions.
Thanks, Dan. One of the questions that we got was, what is the difference between One Water and integrated water resource management?
Yeah, that's a great question. In my opinion, there's not much difference. There's a lot of terms being used out there: integrated water resources management, integrated watershed management, total water management. They all are fundamentally the same in the sense that you want to look more holistically at all of the water resources. I think One Water maybe took that principle one step forward in the sense of it really does try to bring in the wastewater side, the stormwater side with the water resources side to be able to uncover some of those multi-purpose, multi-beneficial projects. But they're all very similar in concept.
Okay, thank you. Can you give an example of how One Water has helped garner public support for investments?
Yeah, one of the things about One Water is it is a more, I'd say, sort of transparent way of decision making. You're putting all of the pieces of the puzzle out there for stakeholders to see. And in Los Angeles, for example, when we did the One Water program, before we were doing the program, we actually had a lot of, I would say, mistrust from the public in terms of just the way utilities make investments. The city of Los Angeles was actually in several lawsuits, involving discharges of water into the Santa Monica Bay. When we did the program, we involved, all of the public stakeholders, including those that were that had the lawsuits against LA, and we did it in a very open, transparent process. Through that discovery, we were able to incorporate a lot of what the stakeholders wanted to see in terms of alternatives, and as a result, the program recommended wastewater rate increases, which were approved by the City Council because of the support of the stakeholders. And I talked a little bit about that $500 million bond measure to pay for green infrastructure. That happened because of those stakeholders. The stakeholders in that process went, door to door and got people to, excited about developing green infrastructure programs. And so through that support, we were able to raise that money and implement all of those green infrastructure projects that are so important right now to the city of Los Angeles.
Okay, and one more. How much time does it take CDM Smith to implement the water integration tool?
So there are various, ways we can implement this, as I said before. When we're doing more of a broader watershed approach, we can implement this tool pretty quickly in a matter of a few months. With data, that is either published, in terms of, let's say, past studies or reports, we can take that in. Where we have, let's say, historical gauge data on rivers or groundwater basins, we can pull that data in as well. When we're dealing with a more micro level, where we're looking at a particular urban city, for example, and we have to incorporate things like wastewater and water capacity, system capacity, then it can take a little bit longer, usually maybe 4 to 5 months to implement the tool.
All right, thanks, Dan. That's all the questions we have for now. I'll remind attendees that please go to the polls section and ask your questions there. We will have a final Q&A at the end of our session. But with that, let's turn it over to Dr. Maimoe and talk about some climate change models.
Thanks, Dan. Dan showed us an impressive tool that really looked at all of the elements of a water cycle. And he also mentioned something that I'm going to be addressing, and that is risk. And of course, one of the primary risks that we're experiencing for anyone who's looked at the news is, of course, climate change risk. And so I think I want to make one point right up front, and I think this has been made in the press now recently quite frequently. We're very used to thinking about climate change as something coming, something we can plan for, and we have time, and we'll get the groundwater, the global climate models output, and we'll think about it. But that is no longer the case. Climate change is affecting us now. The impacts are significant, and unfortunately, no country is immune. We've all seen the news reports, extreme heat in the Pacific Northwest, flooding in Europe, wildfires in Greece, flooding in Indonesia. That very dramatic almost loss of their entire water supply in Cape Town, South Africa, droughts in Brazil. These things are happening now, and we need tools to be able to understand and prepare and work with these climate change impacts. And of course, one of the biggest impacts of climate change is on our water resources. And this affects ecosystems. It affects agricultural production, communities, global, coastal, inland, urban water systems, you name it, anything to do with water is being affected. But we as engineers, planners, hydrologists have a significant challenge, and that is that the tools that we're used to using no longer work. In other words, the water cycle is no longer stable, and all of the tried and true statistics that we have been applying in the past in order to do our designs or our plans no longer apply. If you look at the two graphics on the right, the upper one demonstrates this fairly dramatically. It happens to be a graphic that shows at the 0 line the average annual precipitation for the contiguous 48 states of the United States. And it's showing brown lines below that on a year-by-year basis. Those are years in which the rainfall was a little less than the average, and green above the line years which the rainfall was a bit more. And you can see that this runs from 1900 to 2020. And if you're looking, you'll see that up until about 1970, there was a fairly random pattern: dry, wet, some drier, some wetter. What we normally see, and which our statistics in the past have covered quite nicely. But around 1970, climate change impacts really began to take hold. And if you look to the right of 1970, between 70 and 2020, you'll see that it's predominantly green. In other words, the pattern has shifted quite dramatically towards a wetter climate. The bottom graph is what we call an intensity duration frequency curve, or a depth duration frequency curve. I'm going to be using this a couple of times, so let me take us a minute to just explain it. On the horizontal axis, we have a measure of the probability, the annual probability of an event occurring. It's often referred to as a recurrence interval in years. So for example, a 50-year recurrence interval actually represents about a 2% chance in any given year that that event will occur or be exceeded. On the vertical axis, in this particular one, we're talking about intensities of storms. And each one of these colored lines represents a different duration: a 1 hour storm, a 2, a 6, a 12, a 24. It's not critical. And what the solid lines represent are the existing intensity duration frequency curves that we've been working with in the Eastern United States at a particular location. But what we did was we took the last 20 years, or actually 1995 to 2015, and we recalculated those IDF curves using this shifted climate. And you can see that the color-coded dashed lines are significantly more intense than the IDF curves that we have officially for our use in design. So if we were designing using the official ones, we would be designing for the past and not for the future, or even for the current situation. I think this just highlights how critical it is for us to use tools now to understand both what's happening now and in the future. So if our tools no longer work, what can we do? Well, we need actionable climate change projections. And I use the word actionable because the tools we have are global climate models. But these require new tools and approaches. And as Dan mentioned, we must be incredibly flexible, because as anyone who's followed this knows, those models are being updated quite frequently, and the results change. So I'm going to focus on two challenges today. There are many, but I'm going to focus on extreme precipitation and inland flooding, and coastal storm surges and flooding. But first, where do we get our current climate information and future climate information? Well, they come from the global climate models. Now, these are being developed and run by institutions around the world. There are now upwards of 40. There tend to be groups of academic institutions, government institutions, research organizations, and so forth. And they are in many, many countries. Most of them are shown here. And each one develops a global climate model and runs a bunch of scenarios. And they also agree under the International Panel on Climate Change to run a set of standard scenarios so that they can be compared. And one of the challenges is that each one of these models tends to give a different result. And so we have to deal with that as engineers, practical engineers, hydrologists, and planners. So that's how we get our information. We know what's at stake. Droughts, flood production are all at stake. Water supply reliability, there's flooding, extreme heat, ecological stress, our changes to the water quality. All of these things we're experiencing, and we need to plan for and calculate the associated risks. So let's address two key challenges and the tools that we can in order to address these. The first is, as I mentioned, that global climate model precipitation projections are generally not actionable. And I say that for the following reason. They are too general in order to take a very short time step. I'll talk about that in 1 second. But the second key challenge is coastal risks. And here we need to both combine our probabilities associated with these storms that occasionally hit the coast with sea level rise, because the two interact and change the probabilities quite dramatically. So if the global climate models are producing results that are not actionable because they produce daily results that are not really very, very similar to what we actually experience locally. We can get downscale daily precipitation results, but they tend to spread the water out a little bit and don't actually reflect the storm intensities that we would find almost anywhere in the world. So at a short time step, they must be modified. So this is what we developed in terms of doing that. We used something called the modified delta change factor approach. I use the word modified because the delta change factor approach is something that's being used around the world. It's quite common, and it generally uses a factor approach to modify a gauge, a rain gauge. We modified it because we found two things or three things that are really, really important. Well, here's how it works. We take downscaled daily precipitation from a number of models, and again, we need an ensemble of models because they all give different results. Ensembling is a whole discussion in and of itself, perhaps a topic for another day. But we do take these daily results and we'll take a current period and we'll take a future period, for example, the end of the century. And we will line them up, separate them out by season, and then sort them by storm size from the largest daily amounts to the smallest daily amounts. And then we will calculate the change between the future and the current. And we do that by percentage because, again, the actual amounts that the global climate models produce are not actually very accurate in terms of local conditions. So we have to work with percentages. These become what we call our change factors. Then we go over onto the right side of this graph and we take a local gauge. And we need a local gauge with hourly or sub-hourly rainfall. And we split that up into seasons. We aggregate those into daily amounts. And then we rank those by size within each season. Once we've done that, we can line up the percentiles from the delta change factors to the percentiles from the gauge on daily rainfall amounts. And we can create a future daily amount time series for the end of century based on our change factors. Once we've done that, if we have kept the date stamps and the times and the actual hourly patterns, we disaggregate once again, and what we have is the standard that we're looking for, the golden standard, which is an hourly future rainfall time series, which is very, very locally adapted and accurate for the local conditions that you are interested in. So once we have that, and let me just mention that this modified delta change factor approach has been peer reviewed. We've published on it, and it has a couple of very important aspects, which I'll repeat here. There's no reliance on directly downscaled GCM output because we can't do that for these applications. It applies GCM-derived change factors on a locally measured precipitation to be as accurate as possible for the locality you're interested in. And very importantly, it accounts for storm size, storm-based properties, the size, the duration, and the seasonality. So what do we get out of this? Well, here's an example. This happens to be for a job that we did in Philadelphia on the East Coast of the United States. And what I'm showing you here is simply the output. What you get are change factors for the highest or largest storms. These are the 90th to 100th percentiles on the top of the graph. And for the smallest storms, and all of them in between. I just split it to make it fit on the screen. The red is the ensemble result for the change factors for a number of models that we used. And you can see that the large storms are projected to increase upwards of 20%, quite a significant increase in intensity, whereas the small storms do not change very much at all. And every season gives a different result. So again, this is emphasizing the importance of using this approach. On the right, I just added the minimum and maximum. Those happen to be single model results from the GCMs. The minimum one is the model that predicted the smallest changes, and in some cases actually suggested that the intensities would go down. But of all the models we used, the majority of them said, no, the intensity is going up. And the model that gave the highest intensity showed a factor of almost 50% for these large storms. That just highlights the need for ensembling because we have no idea which model is the most accurate. So what do we do with this information? Well, let's go back to our standard design. tools, the IDF curves, or the intensity, duration, frequency curves. So here is one in a work that we did in Virginia, for example. And again, you see along the horizontal axis, the recurrence interval in years from 1 to 500. And on the vertical axis, this happens to be a 24-hour storm. And the standard IDF curves for this here are shown in blue. Those are the intensities that we expect with a different recurrence interval. And then, having used our approach, we can factor that up for end of century, and you can see a significant increase is projected in all of the intensities across the board for all the frequency of storms for this 24-hour storm. The red range shows the 10th and the 90th percentile, and I'll show you how we got that in a second. So we have a modified delta change factor approach, and this tool will give us very, very practical, locally adjusted future precipitation time series. But what it's giving us is what we think is the most likely one based on an ensemble of models. But we all know that rainfall is extremely variable, and this is another thing that we have to explore. And so if we take the central tendency, we might be underestimating the risk, particularly for very vulnerable or critical assets. And so we want to know something about the future variability or even the current variability. And therefore, we developed what we call a stochastic weather generator. And again, in looking at the literature, this tends to be a very complex process. And we decided that we could make it a lot more practical and simple for a wider application to explore this variability. So the way it works, actually, and I don't have time to talk about that here. Again, another talk might be of interest, or we could talk in the question and answer. But essentially what I've done is I've taken the actual probabilities of the storms, or the storms that have occurred over a period of time. And instead of breaking storms into factors and trying to develop probability distributions for each factors and then sampling that and recreating storms, I simply considered the actual pattern of storms that we've seen to be the probability set. And if I sample from those with replacement, I can randomly reintegrate and reproduce a period of time, maybe 100 or 1,000 times, and explore the potential variability. So what does that get us? Well, here's our IDF curve again. This time, again, this is an IDF curve that is exploring the variability that might occur with our existing tools. So the red line is actually our existing IDF curve for a location on the east coast of the United States. If we apply the stochastic weather generator, we can see that that IDF curve might have a huge variability. It could have been a lot drier, it could have been a lot wetter, and we might want to know what the 10th or the 90th percentile is, and not just the central IDF curve if we're interested in probabilities and risk assessments. But more importantly, we can apply this same tool to the future. So if we use our modified delta change factor to give us a future time series, we can then apply the stochastic weather generator to look at the climate change shift. And that's what this graph is showing you here. So once again, you see the red line, which is our current intensity, duration, frequency curve for a variety of recurrence intervals. The dotted lines around that are the stochastic weather generators show of natural variability under current conditions, and then the dashed green lines show how that shifts upward in the future based on our modified delta change factor. So you can see two things here. One, the natural variability for any given IDF curve is actually much wider than the projected climate shift. So we really, really need to think about this and have both factors in our arsenal of tools. The other, of course, is it's in this particular location, the very driest future intensity or least intense storms are projected to be somewhat similar to what we are now experiencing today, and the more extreme ones significantly more intense. That was precipitation. Let me spend a little bit of time on the second challenge, which is coastal risk. Here we have two sets of information that we need. One are sea level rise projections. The other are the probability projections for coastal storm surges, which are actually the elevations that a particular storm surge might reach and its probability, again, using our familiar return intervals in years. Global climate global sea level rise projections are readily available for every location in the world. This one happens to be for a place in Virginia along the East Coast. But what you're seeing, of course, is the incredible variety of projections from extremely low ones to extremely high. And this, of course, presents a challenge because we are not exactly sure on which curve we are running at this particular time. But we have this information, it's readily available, and it's locally variable. The second is storm surge probabilities. This tends to be a little less available. We're luckily in the United States, and I think similar data are available in Europe and many parts of Asia. But it is a tidal evaluation of return periods for coastal flooding. So you see on the vertical axis meters above mean high water, and then the return interval of how frequently that is likely to occur. This has been done around the United States for all the tidal gauges that have a significant amount of record. We have all of that information at our disposal. We can also calculate it ourselves rather easily for any tide gauge that hasn't done that calculation. The second available information about these probabilities are from storm surge models, and these are readily available in the United States for most coasts, and again, in many other parts of the world as well. So you will have probabilities for storm surges, and you have the sea level rise projections. So how do they work interactively together? This graphic kind of explains that. So let's say you have on the lower left an asset at a particular elevation, and it has its current level of protection, which is on the right-hand vertical axis, which is a probability of flooding. And let's say that's, I don't know, 500-year storm is likely to occur. And we consider that a good level of protection. Well, as time goes on, sea level rise occurs, and that level of protection slowly goes down. In other words, the probability of flooding increases. And let's say the green line is what we have decided was an acceptable level of risk for this particular asset. Well, in this particular graphic, by around 2035, we're crossing that critical line, and the probability of flooding has now increased to below a 100-year return interval, or greater than 1% per year. And we have to start thinking about what we're going to do to protect that. So sea level rise and storm surges interact in a way that shows a slow erosion of our protection. So we have a very good tool for this, a simple one. We made it, again, as practical as possible. It only requires one input as a single input, and then there are two optional inputs in addition. So all you have to do in the red on the opening screen of this Excel tool, you will see you put in your asset elevation, your location elevation, whatever you're interested in. Now, if it's an asset and you wanted to explore its risk of flooding over the lifetime of that asset, you could put a start year for the asset and an end year for the asset optionally as well. That's all there is to it. We have the sea level rises in the tool itself. And we can program it with any local storm surge probabilities that are available quite quickly. So what does this give us? Well, it produces a year-by-year erosion of the return interval for the particular elevation that you entered. So here you're looking at one, for example, with 5 different sea level rise projections from low to high. And here we're looking at the 2000 to 2020 portion. And you can see that this particular asset in 2000 was designed to be protected to a 50-year return interval. But by 2020, depending on which sea level rise scenario you choose to use, it's already eroded down to about an 18 to 30 protective return interval. And of course, if you begin to look at the end of century, things get quite dire. In this case, it's quite clearly flooded in most applications, and even for the very lowest sea level rise scenario, which we generally now think is highly unlikely, it's going to be much more than that. It's already eroded by the end of century to less than 5 years. So you can see here that the storm surge probabilities are heavily affected by sea level rise. Now, if you have added a beginning and an end for your asset, in this case, it was a 20-year asset between 2020 and 2040, the tool will also tell you what your likelihood is of being flooded at least once over the lifetime of that asset. In this case, you can see again, for example, for the lowest sea level rise scenario, you still have a 40% chance of being flooded. And for the extreme one, you have about a 100% chance of being flooded during 2020 to 2040. So to summarize, clearly, I think we all know it's stating the obvious. Climate change's impacts are here and now. They're not just something in the future. We clearly should stop designing for the past, and we must design for both the current situation and the future. And we cannot rely on our old hydrologic assumptions. As engineers and planners, the global climate model output is fantastic, but it is very often for many applications not possible to be used directly. We need practical tools for analysis, and the modified delta change factor approach, our stochastic weather generator, the changing flood frequency tool, these are all tools that are very practical and turn the global climate model projections into useful form for our plans and designs. Some of them, of course, are directly applicable. So what we have here, certainly for the precipitation, because we have future time series at any time step, depending on the gauge information, we can use them in tools like the water integration pool or familiar engineering tools like the design storms, or we can use them directly into any kind of hydrologic or hydraulic model, or produce design storms and future IDF curves, as I showed you. And one last point, of course, where data is available, we can make use of these tools. Where it is not, we should all be very much advocates for supporting additional monitoring, because as you can see from these kinds of tools, we must be staying on top of climate change impacts. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions that may be out there.
Thanks, Mark. A couple things here. For the first one, many applications use global climate models directly. Can you explain under what circumstances this is possible and when it's not, and when we have to use the tools that you're talking about?
Yes. Generally, the global climate model outputs for temperature are very, very good on a daily basis and usually can be used quite directly. For precipitation, it's a little bit tricky. For monthly or seasonable or annual applications, and very often water supply studies, reservoir operations, looking at those kinds of things, you can use the GCM output directly. As soon as you get much below monthly, as I mentioned, the storm patterns, any application that relies on extreme storms or the way storms occur over a short period of time, hours or days, you need the tools that I am recommending, because then the direct use of the precipitation output from global climate models, no matter how well downscaled it's been, tends to not be accurate enough for those applications.
All right, great. Second question, how easy is it to develop a local changing flood frequency tool?
Actually, very easy. As I said, the global climate, the sea level rise projections are readily available for any location around the world. They can be inputted into this tool probably with about an hour's work. Depending on the availability of storm surge probabilities, if they are available either from models or from tidal gauges, again, another 2 hours or 3 hours, and you've probably developed your local tool. So you're talking about half a day. If there are no published extreme values for storm surge, but there is a tidal gauge, then you probably need a couple of days to do the analysis yourself before you can enter it into the tool. And of course, if you do not have storm surge tidal monitoring data available with a reasonable period of time, then you cannot do this. And that's why I suggest that we be all supporting this kind of monitoring.
All right, great. Let me double check here. Anything else came in? Doesn't look like it, Mark. So can you advance to the next slide, please?
I will.
All right, thank you. So thank you to everyone for attending today. We hope that you were able to take something from this session that helps you and your organization build resiliency faster. We look forward to continuing the discussion and welcome any further questions you have. Please feel free to contact any of us through the information provided. Oh, I'm sorry, Sandy's showing me that there's questions in the poll. So let me go to that real quick. I did not see that. I'm not seeing those, Sandy. So do you mind asking those? Let's see if we can find here.
Ah, the joys of Zoom meetings.
Andy, you're on mute if you're trying to talk.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can.
Yeah. Sorry, Sandy, I don't see those for some reason. So
I sent you a link, Jeff, but I think, let me just look and see. They're actually, I think they're related to the One Water discussion.
That's fine.
One I see here.
yeah, I have them now. Yeah.
You see them? Okay, go for it.
Okay, so Dan, the first question is the role of institutions or the regulatory mechanism in implementing high technical solutions and the role of stakeholders. Can you talk to that at all?
Jeff, can you repeat that?
Yeah, it's what is the role of institutions or the regulatory mechanism in implementing high technical solutions like something like this, and the role of stakeholders? I guess what's our experience with that?
Yeah, I think let's see if I can take a shot, and if for some reason I'm a little off course, just let Jeff know. But you know, when we start these One Water plans, it is important to have regulators at the table, because they are looking for, it's been our experience that they're looking for partnerships, and getting them involved early means we're addressing the kinds of concerns that they may have. And one of the particular areas that we've seen where that's been beneficial is when we start talking about potable reuse. Obviously, potable reuse is emerging. There's obvious public concerns about potable reuse, right? Using treated wastewater for water supply. And the technology to treat that water is well established, and it is being used successfully around the globe. Singapore, Texas, California, and now Florida. So understanding the regulations and understanding the regulatory perspective is very vital in your One Water planning. So I don't know if that addressed the question, but our experience has been when we involve those regulators early on, we do see a more robust set of recommendations that can be implementable.
Yeah, and a follow-up question to that, Dan, was does One Water integrate groups, say the government's water section, environmental section, et cetera? I guess what you're saying is yes, that those are people that are part of the process.
Yeah, here's a very important consideration or issue, right? When we're dealing with One Water plans, we're often dealing with organizations that have their own missions, very clearly established missions. So, you might have a water resources agency that is, purely looking at, hey, the source water quality and the availability of water rights. You might have another organization that is dealing with public health, right? And water quality issues. And you might have another one that's dealing with environmental and ecological health. One Water is not advocating that those institutions collapse into one big new organization. That's not feasible. But what One Water can do is bring those different perspectives together to take a more holistic viewpoint. And this can be done at that state level, at that regional level, and at the municipality level. There aren't a lot of agencies, for example, that manage water, wastewater, and stormwater. There's a handful of those agencies around the globe. More commonly, we're going to be dealing at the urban municipal level with a water provider. Sometimes that's also a wastewater provider, a separate entity for water or stormwater, and a separate entity for watershed health. What we're trying to do with One Water is to get those folks talking to each other and get them to collaborate with each other. And so we all know we're all strapped. We're all looking for the same money. Resources are tight. And so if we can form partnerships, we can do more, right? We can do more with the limited money that we have.
Okay, great. One last question here. You mentioned one output of the water integration tool is CapEx and OpEx figures. How does that aspect of the WIT model operate?
Yeah, so what we do is we take our current system cost, which are readily available. So if there's any remaining debt service on the capital projects, we'll incorporate that, and then we'll incorporate the OpEx costs for treatment, distribution, all of those costs. So we'll aggregate those current costs into an overall unit cost, like dollars per 1,000 gallon, for example. Then for each of the new options that we want to explore, we will estimate the capital cost that's associated with that new option. So let's say it's a brackish groundwater treatment system. So we'll know what the capital costs are. We know what we'll input the OpEx costs, the operating costs per year, and then we'll estimate the portion of costs that are fixed, meaning those costs are going to occur even if the plant goes idle. And we'll estimate the costs that are variable. So when the plant is operating and producing water, we'll know that. And then the model keeps track of how often that groundwater, that brackish desalination plant is utilized, and it will calculate an average unit cost. And then the model then can come up with an average aggregate unit cost that averages the existing system costs and all the new options together. And so we can then use that to estimate the overall sort of what is the future cost going to be? And that can be used for rate making or financial evaluations or things of that nature.
Great, thanks, Dan. Well, we're 1 minute past our time, so we look forward to continuing the discussion and welcome any further questions. Please put them in the polls in the chat and include your email so we can get back to you directly. There's a couple we didn't get to today, but that are left emails and we'll get back to you directly. And thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your World Water Week. Thanks, everybody.